The year is 1803, and Thomas Jefferson has just made what might be the greatest real estate deal in human history. Think about this for a moment. With one signature, one payment of $15 million, the United States has just doubled in size. Doubled? We're talking about 828,000 square miles of what exactly? That's the thing that gets me about the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson didn't really know what he was buying. Nobody did. Oh, sure, they had some rough maps drawn by French explorers, maybe a few reports from fur traders who'd ventured up the Missouri River. But for the most part, everything west of the Mississippi River was a giant question mark on the American map. A question mark the size of modern-day Alaska, Texas, and California combined. Now Jefferson being Jefferson, brilliant, curious, always thinking 3 moves ahead, he immediately started planning how to answer that question. And his solution? 2 men named Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, along with what they called the Corps of Discovery. 33 people total, heading into complete unknown territory with instructions that basically boiled down to go west. Don't die, tell us what you find. But here's what I want you to understand about this moment in 1804 when Lewis and Clark push off from Camp Wood and start paddling up the Missouri River. They're not just exploring, they're creating something entirely new in American history. They're about to encounter a landscape so vast, so rich, so completely untouched by European civilization that it will fundamentally change what it means to be American. The Corps spends 2 years and 4 months in that wilderness. 2 years. And 4 months of grizzly bears that stand 8 feet tall and weigh 800 pounds. Rivers that seem to flow forever through landscapes that make the Grand Canyon look like a roadside ditch. Native tribes who've never seen white men before, some friendly, some decidedly not. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, more beaver than you could imagine. When Lewis and Clark returned to St. Louis in September 1806, and remember, many people thought they were dead, they bring back something that changes everything: stories. Stories of rivers so thick with beaver that you could practically walk across them on the animals' backs. Stories of mountain ranges that stretch beyond the horizon. Stories of native peoples with horses and knowledge and trade networks that span half the continent. But most importantly for our story, they bring back beaver pelts. Now, if you're listening to this in the 21st century, you might think, beaver pelts, really? That's what started one of the most dramatic chapters in American history. But you have to understand what beaver meant in the early 1800s. This wasn't just about fur. This was about fashion, status, and serious money. In London, Paris, New York, everywhere that mattered in the civilized world, gentlemen wore beaver felt hats. Not just any hats. Beaver felt hats were the finest, most expensive, most prestigious headwear money could buy. The beaver's undercoat, when processed correctly, created a felt so smooth, so water-resistant, so perfectly shaped that it became the ultimate symbol of respectability and wealth. And here's the key economic fact that drives everything that follows. A prime beaver pelt that cost maybe 50 cents to trap in the Rocky Mountains could sell for $6 in St. Louis. $6. That's more than a month's wages for most Americans. If you were good, if you were lucky, if you survived, you could make in one trapping season what a farmer might earn in 5 years. The math was simple. The execution, well, that was something else entirely. The first men who followed Lewis and Clark's trail west weren't your typical pioneers. These weren't families looking for farmland or merchants seeking trading opportunities. These were young men, usually very young men, with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Farm boys tired of following a plough horse through the same fields their fathers had ploughed, city clerks suffocating behind counting house desks, immigrants who'd crossed an ocean only to find opportunity still just out of reach. But here's what's fascinating about these early mountain men. They weren't just running towards something. They were running away from something too. The America of 1810, 1815 was still a pretty rigid place. Class mattered. Family connections mattered. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born ordinary, you stayed ordinary. The mountains didn't care about any of that. Take a man like Hugh Glass, and we'll hear much more about Hugh Glass later, believe me. In the civilized world, Hugh Glass was nobody special. Maybe a sailor, maybe a carpenter, definitely not someone who'd ever be remembered by history. But in the mountains, Hugh Glass becomes the man who crawled 200 miles after being mauled by a grizzly bear. In the mountains, Hugh Glass becomes legend. That transformation from ordinary man to something beyond ordinary, that's what the wilderness offered. Not just money, though the money was real. Not just adventure, though the adventure was constant. The wilderness offered the chance to become someone completely different. Someone stronger, tougher, more capable than you ever imagined you could be. And the fur companies, they understood this psychology perfectly. By 1820, the competition for those western beaver streams was heating up. John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company was battling the British Hudson's Bay Company and Northwest Company for control of the fur trade. These weren't small operations we're talking about. Astor was one of the richest men in America. We'd probably call him a billionaire today. The British companies had been perfecting the fur trade for 200 years. But they all needed the same thing. Men willing to spend months alone in the wilderness, facing dangers that would terrify most people, all for the chance of striking it rich. The recruitment was often surprisingly straightforward. A company agent would show up in St. Louis or Independence, Missouri, the jumping-off points for the western frontier, with a simple proposition: sign a 3-year contract. We'll provide your supplies, your traps, your rifle. You provide the muscle, the skill, and the willingness to disappear into country where the only law is what you make for yourself. Some men signed up for the money, others for the freedom. Some were running from debts, or the law, or broken hearts, or just the suffocating sameness of civilized life. But they all shared one thing, the belief that they could survive where others couldn't. The confidence, some might say the arrogance, to think they could master a landscape that had killed countless others before them. And you know what? Many of them were wrong, terribly, fatally wrong. The mountains were not forgiving of overconfidence, or under-preparation, or bad luck. The grizzly bears didn't care how tough you thought you were. The Blackfeet warriors didn't care about your dreams of wealth. Winter didn't negotiate. But some of them were exactly as tough as they thought they were, maybe tougher. These were the men who would become the mountain men, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, through a process of elimination that was as brutal as it was effective. The weak died quickly. The unlucky died eventually. The smart learned fast or didn't live long enough to learn at all. What emerged from this process were men unlike anything America had produced before, men who could track a wounded elk through a snowstorm, who could survive on pine bark and leather when game disappeared, who could read the landscape like a book written in animal sign and weather patterns. They developed their own language, mixing English with Spanish and French and half a dozen Native American tongues. They created their own code of honor that valued skill and courage above everything else. They formed partnerships and friendships that would be tested by hunger, cold, violence, and the constant presence of death. And they pushed deeper into the mountains than anyone had gone before. By 1825, these mountain men had explored every major river system west of the Mississippi. They'd found South Pass, the only place wagons could cross the Continental Divide. They'd established relationships with dozens of native tribes, some friendly, some hostile, all complex. They'd learned to think like the animals they hunted and the enemies who hunted them. Most importantly, they'd proven something that would reshape American history. The western wilderness could be mastered. Not easily, not safely, but it could be done. And if it could be done, then it could be settled. And if it could be settled, then it would be settled. The mountain men didn't know it yet, but they were writing the first chapter of Manifest Destiny. Every trail they blazed, every river they mapped, every mountain pass they discovered was laying the groundwork for the great western migration that would follow. The Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the routes that would carry hundreds of thousands of settlers west. These all began as paths walked by men carrying beaver traps and living entirely outside civilization's reach. But that's getting ahead of our story. In the early 1820s, the mountain men weren't thinking about manifest destiny or the future of America. They were thinking about survival, about the next stream that might hold beaver, about making it through another winter, about becoming rich enough to retire back to civilization, though many would discover that once the mountains got into your blood, civilization became impossible to tolerate. This is their story, the story of men who chose to live entirely on their own terms in a landscape that offered everything: freedom, wealth, adventure, meaning, and demanded everything in return. Men who became something new in American history, not quite civilized, not quite savage, but something uniquely their own. And it begins, as so many American stories do, with young men looking west and asking themselves a simple question: what if? What if I could make my fortune in a single season? What if I could become someone completely different? What if I could live entirely free? The mountains were waiting with answers. Some of those answers would make men rich, others would make them famous, and some would kill them, but they were all about to find out which was which. Picture this. It's October 1824, somewhere in what we now call Wyoming. A young trapper named James Clyman is checking his beaver traps along a creek when he hears something that makes his blood freeze: the distinctive woof-woof sound of a grizzly bear. Not just any grizzly, a sow with cubs. Now, if you've never encountered a grizzly bear, let me help you understand what Clyman is facing. We're talking about an animal that can weigh 800 pounds and run 35 miles per hour, faster than a horse over short distances. An animal whose claws are 4 inches long and whose bite can crush a bowling ball. An animal that, when it stands on its hind legs, can look a tall man in the eye and still have room to spare. But here's the thing that really gets me about this moment. James Clyman doesn't run. He can't run, because running from a grizzly is suicide. Instead, he does something that would seem insane to you or me. He stands perfectly still, makes himself as small as possible, and waits. The sow approaches to within 10 feet. 10 feet. Clyman can smell her breath, can see the intelligence in her small, dark eyes as she decides whether he's a threat to her cubs. For what feels like hours but is probably only minutes, man and bear regard each other in complete silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, the grizzly turns and walks away. Clyman later wrote that this encounter taught him something crucial about mountain life. Survival wasn't about being the toughest or the fastest or even the smartest. Survival was about understanding your place in a world where you were never, ever at the top of the food chain. This is the reality that every mountain man had to learn, usually within his first few months in the wilderness. The mountains didn't care about your confidence, or your dreams of wealth, or your plans for the future. The mountains operated by rules that were millions of years older than human civilization, and you either learned those rules, or you died. Let me tell you about a typical day in the life of a mountain man, because I think it's important to understand just how different this existence was from anything most Americans had ever experienced. You wake up before dawn, not because you want to, but because that's when the beaver are most active. Your blankets are frozen to your body from the moisture of your own breath. The temperature might be 20 degrees below zero, and there's no coffee, no warm breakfast, no shelter except whatever you've managed to construct from branches and buffalo hide. You eat a piece of dried buffalo meat, if you have it, and maybe some parched corn. Then you strap on snowshoes that you've made yourself from willow branches and rawhide, pick up your rifle, which you've kept warm next to your body, all night so the metal won't crack, and head out to check your trap line. The trap line might extend for 20 miles along various streams and beaver ponds. 20 miles of wading through icy water, often up to your waist, setting and checking steel traps that weigh 4 pounds each. Your legs go numb within minutes, but you can't stop. Can't rest, because every day you're not checking traps is money lost, and winter is short enough already. And while you're doing all this, you're constantly watching, listening, because you're never alone out there. There are wolves that travel in packs of 30 or more. There are mountain lions that can drop out of trees onto your back without making a sound. There are bears, not just grizzlies, but black bears, which are smaller but often more aggressive. And then there are the Blackfeet. Now, we need to talk about the Blackfeet, because they're absolutely central to understanding what life was like for mountain men. The Blackfeet Confederacy, the Blackfeet, Blood and Piegan tribes, controlled a huge territory in what's now Montana and southern Alberta, and they had decided, quite reasonably from their perspective, that white trappers were invaders who needed to be killed or driven out. This wasn't random violence or savage hostility. This was strategic warfare. The Blackfeet understood that beaver were a limited resource, and every pelt taken by American trappers was one less pelt they could trade to British companies. More importantly, they recognized that the mountain men were the advance guard of something much larger and more threatening, American expansion into their homeland, so they hunted the trappers with the same skill and patience that the trappers hunted beaver. A Blackfeet war party might follow a trapper for days, learning his routines, identifying his camp, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They preferred to attack at dawn, when their target was most vulnerable. The first sign of trouble would be the whistle of arrows, and by then it was usually too late. The mountain men developed their own counter-strategies. They learned to vary their routes, to set false camps, to read the landscape for signs of human presence. They slept with their rifles and kept their horses picketed close enough to reach in seconds. They developed an almost supernatural awareness of their surroundings, the ability to sense when something wasn't quite right, when the birds were too quiet or the wind was carrying an unfamiliar scent. But even the most careful, most experienced trapper could find himself in a situation like the one that Hugh Glass faced in August 1823. Glass was hunting alone, already a risky decision, in what's now South Dakota, when he stumbled into a thicket and surprised a grizzly sow with cubs. The bear attacked instantly, and what happened next became one of the most famous survival stories in American history. The grizzly knocked Glass down, bit him, clawed him, literally tore pieces of flesh from his body. His companions, hearing his screams, came running and managed to drive off the bear, but Glass was so badly mauled they were certain he was dying. His scalp was hanging loose, his throat was torn open, one leg was broken, and he had deep claw marks across his back and chest. 2 men volunteered to stay with Glass until he died, then bury him properly. But after 2 days, worried about Blackfeet in the area and convinced Glass couldn't possibly survive, they took his rifle, his knife, and most of his equipment and left him for dead. Here's where the story becomes almost impossible to believe, except that it's documented by multiple sources. Glass regained consciousness, found himself alone and without weapons in hostile territory, and made a decision that defies comprehension. He would crawl to the nearest fort, 200 miles away. 200 miles, with a broken leg, infected wounds, and no supplies except what he could forage. Glass crawled during the cool parts of the day and rested during the heat. He ate berries, roots, and carrion left by wolves, including, famously, maggots which actually helped clean his infected wounds. He set his own broken leg using a fallen log for leverage. When his wounds became infected, he let maggots clean them rather than die of gangrene. It took him 6 weeks. 6 weeks of crawling across prairie, through streams, over rocky ground, that tore his clothes to shreds and reopened his wounds daily. When he finally reached Fort Kiowa, the men there didn't recognize him. He looked more like a walking corpse than a human being. But here's what I find most remarkable about Hugh Glass's story. When he finally recovered, when he'd tracked down the men who'd abandoned him, he forgave them. He understood that they'd made a reasonable decision under impossible circumstances. That's the mountain man code. You survived however you could, and you didn't hold grudges about other people trying to do the same. Glass went back to trapping. Of course he did, because that's what these men were like. The wilderness might maul them, freeze them, starve them, but it couldn't break them. The mountains had gotten into their blood, and there was no going back to civilization after that. Winter was the ultimate test of everything a mountain man had learned about survival. In the high country, winter could last 6 months, with temperatures dropping to 40 degrees below zero. Snow might pile 20 feet deep. Game would disappear entirely for weeks at a time. The trappers developed strategies that sound almost mythical today. They would cache food and supplies in hidden locations marked only by subtle signs. A particular arrangement of stones, a blaze on a tree trunk. They learned to build shelters that could withstand winds strong enough to knock down trees. They discovered which plants could prevent scurvy, which animals were safe to eat when they were half-starved and desperate. Some winters, when the snow was too deep and the cold too severe, groups of mountain men would hole up together in what they called winter camps. And these weren't social gatherings, they were survival alliances. Men would pool their resources, share their skills, and help each other make it through the months when the wilderness became actively murderous. The psychological pressure of these winter camps was intense. Imagine being trapped in a one-room cabin with 5 or 6 other men for 4 solid months, with no privacy, no escape, and the constant knowledge that if someone got sick or injured, there was no help coming until spring. Tempers flared. Arguments over trivial matters could escalate into knife fights. Some men went what they called mountain crazy, a form of cabin fever that could lead to violence or complete mental breakdown. But those who survived these ordeals came out transformed. They'd learned to endure isolation, hunger, cold, and fear that would have broken most civilized men. They'd developed a confidence, born of having faced the worst the wilderness could offer and lived to tell about it. The physical transformation was just as dramatic. A man who spent 5 years in the mountains looked nothing like the farm boy or city clerk who'd headed west. His skin was dark and weathered from constant exposure to sun and wind. His hair was long and often braided with beads and feathers in native style. His body was lean and hard, every ounce of fat burned away by constant activity and irregular meals. But it was the mental transformation that really set mountain men apart. They developed what we might call a wilderness consciousness, a way of thinking that was completely adapted to life in an unforgiving environment. They learned to plan for disasters that might never come, while staying flexible enough to handle the disasters they never planned for. They became students of weather, able to predict storms hours before they arrived by reading cloud formations and wind patterns. They learned animal behavior so thoroughly they could think like prey when being hunted and like predators when hunting. They developed an almost supernatural sense of direction that allowed them to navigate thousands of miles of unmarked wilderness without getting lost. Most importantly, they learned to live entirely in the present moment. In the mountains, yesterday was gone, and tomorrow might never come. What mattered was, right now, the immediate decisions that meant the difference between life and death. This mindset created men who were remarkably calm under pressure. When faced with a charging grizzly or a Blackfeet war party, an experienced mountain man didn't panic. He assessed the situation, made the best decision he could with the information available, and acted without hesitation. Hesitation killed. Overthinking killed. Panic killed. By 1830, there were maybe 300 men living this way permanently in the Rocky Mountains. 300 men who had completely adapted to a lifestyle that most humans would find impossible. They had become something new, not quite civilized, not quite savage, but uniquely American. They were also becoming something else, the advanced scouts of manifest destiny. Every stream they trapped, every trail they blazed, every mountain pass they discovered was information that would eventually guide wagon trains and railroad routes. They were writing the map of the American West, one footstep at a time, though. Most of them had no idea they were doing anything more than trying to get rich and stay alive. But that larger story was still unfolding. For now, in the 1820s and early 1830s, the mountain men were focused on more immediate concerns: where to find beaver, how to avoid the Blackfeet, and whether they could survive. Another winter in country that tested the limits of human endurance. Some would pass these tests and become legends. Others would fail and become unmarked graves in valleys no civilized person would see for decades to come. But all of them were writing the first chapters of a uniquely American story. The story of what happens when men push beyond every boundary civilization has ever established and discover what they're truly capable of when their backs are against the wall, and there's nowhere left to run except deeper into the unknown. Now here's where the story gets really complicated, and I need you to understand something that most history books get wrong about the mountain men. This wasn't a simple story of white pioneers conquering savage wilderness. This was a story of cultural collision, adaptation, and surprising alliances that created something entirely new on the American continent. Picture a man named Joe Meek, and yes, that was really his name, standing in a Shoshone village in 1832. Joe Meek looks nothing like the farm boy from Virginia who headed west 5 years earlier. His hair is braided with eagle feathers. His clothes are entirely native-made, brain-tanned leather decorated with porcupine quills and trade beads. He speaks fluent Shoshone, knows the names and genealogies of every important family in the tribe, and has just married the daughter of a prominent war chief. But here's the thing that would really surprise you. Joe Meek isn't trying to go native or reject his white identity. He's doing something much more practical and much more complex. He's creating a hybrid existence that allows him to survive and prosper in a world where the old rules, both white and Indian, don't apply anymore. This is the reality of mountain man life that the Hollywood movies never show you. These men didn't live in isolation from native peoples. They lived among them, married into them, learned from them, fought beside them, and sometimes fought against them. The mountain men created the first truly integrated society in American history. Not integrated in any way we'd recognize today, but integrated in ways that were revolutionary for their time. Let me start with the most important relationship of all, the one between mountain men and the Shoshone people. The Shoshone occupied a vast territory in what's now Idaho, Utah, and western Wyoming. They were horse people, buffalo hunters, and skilled traders who had been dealing with Europeans for generations through their connections to Spanish colonies in the south. When the first American trappers appeared in their territory, the Shoshone made a strategic decision that would define the next 30 years of Western history. They decided to ally with the Americans against their traditional enemies, especially the Blackfeet. Now, this wasn't some noble, savage, welcoming, peaceful white brothers nonsense. This was hard-headed politics. The Shoshone had been getting hammered by the Blackfeet for decades. The Blackfeet had guns from British traders, horses by the thousands, and a military organization that could field war parties of 200 warriors or more. The Shoshone were holding their own, but barely. When mountain men started showing up with their own guns, their own horses, and their own reasons to hate the Blackfeet, the Shoshone saw an opportunity. An alliance with these heavily armed whites could tip the balance of power in their favor. The alliance worked both ways. The mountain men got local guides who knew every water source, every game trail, every safe camping spot in hundreds of thousands of square miles of territory. They got early warning of Blackfeet war parties. They got access to the Shoshone horse herds, and if you don't understand how crucial horses were to mountain man survival, let me explain. A man on foot in the Rocky Mountains was usually a dead man. The distances were too vast, the dangers too immediate. But horses weren't just transportation. They were wealth, status symbols, and emergency food supplies all rolled into one. A good mountain horse trained to navigate rocky terrain and stand steady during gunfire was worth more than most men made in a year. The Shoshone had some of the finest horses in North America. They'd been breeding them for specific traits for generations: speed, endurance, sure-footedness, and intelligence. When they granted mountain men access to these horse herds, they were sharing their most valuable resource. In return, the mountain men shared something equally valuable: military technology and tactics, European-style warfare, coordinated charges, concentrated firepower. The combination of Shoshone mobility and American firepower created a military alliance that dominated the Central Rockies for more than a decade. But this alliance went far deeper than just military cooperation. It created a new kind of society. Mountain men began marrying Shoshone women in numbers that shocked government officials when they finally learned about it. And these weren't casual relationships or temporary conveniences. These were formal marriages, recognized by both cultures, that produced children and created kinship networks spanning hundreds of miles. A mountain man who married into a prominent Shoshone family suddenly had relatives throughout the tribe, cousins who would share information about game movements, uncles who would warn him about enemy war parties, in-laws who would trade horses, weapons and supplies at family rates rather than stranger rates. The women themselves were often remarkable people who bridged two worlds with incredible skill. Take a woman like Sacagawea. Yes, the same Sacagawea from Lewis and Clark, though she lived for decades after that expedition. She became a translator, guide, and cultural mediator who understood both native and white customs well enough to negotiate between them. These native wives taught their mountain man husbands skills that meant the difference between life and death, how to read weather patterns unique to the high country, which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous, how to track animals through terrain that left no obvious signs, how to make clothing that would stay flexible in sub-zero temperatures, but the cultural exchange flowed both ways. Mountain men introduced their native families to metal tools, guns, and European-style farming techniques. They brought literacy. Many native wives learned to read and write English. They created hybrid households where children grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable in a Shoshone village and an American trading post. The results of these unions were children who became some of the most important figures in Western history. Mixed-blood kids who grew up speaking 3 or 4 languages, understanding both cultures intimately, and serving as bridges between worlds that were often at war. But not all of the mountain men's relationships with native peoples were friendly. And to understand the full story, we need to talk about the tribe that became their most implacable enemy, the Blackfeet. The Blackfeet weren't hostile to white people because they were savage or bloodthirsty. They were hostile because they were smart. They understood exactly what the American trappers represented, the advance guard of an invasion that would destroy their way of life. The Blackfeet had built their entire economy around the fur trade with British companies. They controlled access to some of the richest beaver streams in North America and used that control to obtain guns, horses, metal goods, and other manufactured items they needed. American trappers weren't just competitors. They were an existential threat to Blackfeet prosperity and independence. So the Blackfeet declared war. Not random raids or opportunistic attacks, but systematic, strategic warfare designed to make the mountain men's lives so dangerous and unprofitable that they'd give up and go home. The tactics were sophisticated and terrifyingly effective. Small war parties would track individual trappers for weeks, learning their routines and identifying their vulnerabilities. They'd steal horses, destroy cache supplies, and set ambushes along frequently used trails. They'd attack at dawn when men were most vulnerable, use superior numbers to overwhelm small parties, and disappear into terrain they knew better than any white man ever could. the psychological warfare was just as important as the physical attacks. The Blackfeet wanted every mountain man to go to sleep, wondering if he'd wake up with arrows in his chest. They wanted every trapper checking his back trail, jumping at unexpected sounds, never feeling completely safe anywhere in the wilderness. And it worked. The mortality rate among trappers working in Blackfeet territory was enormous, maybe 30% per year, which means that if you spent 3 years trapping in Blackfeet country, you had better than even odds of dying there. But here's where the story gets interesting. Some mountain men found ways to deal with the Blackfeet that went beyond simple warfare. They learned Blackfeet language and customs. They studied Blackfeet military tactics. A few even managed to establish temporary truces or safe passage agreements. One of the most famous cases involved a trapper named John Colter, who had an experience that became legendary throughout the mountain man community. Colter was captured by a Blackfeet war party in 1809, while trapping with a partner near Three Forks, Montana. The Blackfeet killed his partner immediately, but they had something special planned for Colter. They stripped him naked, took his weapons, and told him to run. Then they gave him a head start and began pursuing him on foot, a human hunting party, using Colter as prey. Now, John Colter was a tough man and a fast runner, but he was being chased by warriors who knew every inch of the terrain and who were in perfect physical condition. The chase went on for miles across rocky ground that shredded Colter's bare feet. Blood was streaming from his nose from the exertion. His lungs were burning. But Colter had one advantage. He was running for his life, and that gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. He managed to outdistance most of his pursuers, though one warrior stayed close behind him. When that warrior got close enough to use his spear, Colter suddenly stopped, spun around and grabbed the weapon. In the struggle that followed, Colter killed the warrior with his own spear. Then he kept running until he reached the Madison River, where he dived into the water and hid under a pile of driftwood. The Blackfeet searched for hours but never found him. Colter emerged after dark, still naked, still without weapons or supplies, and walked 300 miles to the nearest trading post. 11 days later, he walked into Fort Raymond, looking like a skeleton wrapped in sunburned skin. The men there didn't recognize him at first, but Colter had survived something that should have killed him, and his story spread throughout the mountain man community like wildfire. Stories like this did more than just entertain the trappers around their campfires. They created a mythology that helped these men cope with the constant threat of death. If John Colter could outrun a Blackfeet war party while naked and weaponless, then maybe survival was possible even in the worst circumstances. Maybe skill and determination and sheer stubbornness could overcome impossible odds. But the reality was that most encounters with hostile tribes ended differently. Jim Bridger, one of the most famous mountain men, carried a Blackfeet arrowhead in his back for 3 years because removing it was too dangerous. Hugh Glass, yes, the same Hugh Glass who crawled 200 miles after the grizzly attack, was eventually killed by Arikara. Warriors on the Yellowstone River, even the most skilled and experienced mountain men lived with the knowledge that any day might be their last. The complexity of tribal relationships meant that a mountain man's survival often depended on his ability to read political situations as much as animal tracks. A tribe that was friendly one year might be hostile the next, depending on their relationships with other tribes, their experiences with different groups of whites, or changes in their leadership. The Crow people, for instance, were generally allied with the mountain men against the Blackfeet. But that alliance was constantly shifting based on immediate circumstances. If a group of white trappers behaved badly in Crow territory, stealing horses, mistreating women, showing disrespect to important leaders, the Crow might decide that these particular whites needed to be taught a lesson. Mountain men learned to navigate these relationships with the skill of diplomatic ambassadors. They studied tribal politics, learned the names and histories of important leaders, and understood the complex web of alliances and grudges that governed native diplomacy. Some became so skilled at this cultural navigation that they served as official interpreters and negotiators. Men like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson could sit in a council meeting with multiple tribes and translate not just languages but cultural concepts, helping different groups understand each other's perspectives and reach agreements that might prevent warfare. By the early 1830s, this complex world of alliances and enemies had created something unique in American history, a truly multicultural society where survival depended on your ability to understand and work with people who were completely different from yourself. The mountain men weren't conquering the wilderness, they were joining it, becoming part of an existing network of relationships and power structures that had been developing for thousands of years. They were successful not because they imposed their will on the landscape, but because they learned to adapt to its rules. This adaptation would prove to be one of their greatest strengths, and ultimately, one of the reasons their way of life couldn't survive the coming of civilization to the West. But in the 1820s and early 30s, this cultural flexibility was what kept them alive in one of the most challenging environments human beings had ever tried to master. The mountain men were writing a new chapter in the story of what it meant to be American, a chapter that emphasized adaptation over domination, cooperation over conquest, and survival over everything else. It's July 1825, and if you could somehow transport yourself to a valley in what's now southwestern Wyoming, you'd witness something that had never existed before in human history. Picture this. 1,500 people gathered in a place where, just weeks before, there was nothing but grass, sagebrush, and silence. Mountain men, Indians from a dozen different tribes, traders, company officials, Mexican merchants, all converged on this single spot for what they called the rendezvous. The noise would hit you first. Hundreds of horses whinnying, dogs barking, men shouting greetings in English, French, Spanish, and half a dozen native languages. The crack of rifle fire from shooting competitions. The sound of fiddle music drifting from campfires, where French-Canadian voyageurs are dancing with Shoshone women. Somewhere in the distance, you can hear the rhythmic chanting of a native ceremony mixed with the raucous laughter of trappers telling impossible stories about their adventures. But here's what you need to understand about the rendezvous. This wasn't just a trade fair or a social gathering. This was the beating heart of the mountain man world. The one time each year when these scattered, isolated men came together to create something that was part economic summit, part cultural festival, part Olympic Games, and part complete madness. The rendezvous was the brainchild of William Ashley, a businessman who understood something that other fur company owners had missed. Instead of forcing trappers to haul their pelts hundreds of miles to establish trading posts, why not bring the trading post to them? Meet them halfway, literally, in some predetermined valley where they could conduct a year's worth of business in a few weeks. It was brilliant logistics, and it revolutionized the fur trade. But Ashley probably never imagined what his practical business solution would become. Let me walk you through what happened when a mountain man arrived at Rendezvous after spending 10 months alone in the wilderness. First, understand his mental state. This is a man who hasn't seen another white person in almost a year. He's been living on his own resources, making his own decisions, answering to nobody but himself and the demands of survival. He's probably had conversations with his horse that were longer than any human interaction he's experienced in months. Then suddenly, he rides into this temporary city of 1,500 people, and it's like stepping from silence into a symphony. The sensory overload is incredible. The smells of cooking food, tobacco smoke, and unwashed bodies. The visual chaos of teepees, tents, and lean-tos scattered across the valley. The constant sound of human voices after months of nothing but wind, water, and animal sounds. The first thing he does, the first thing every mountain man does, is look for familiar faces. Who made it through another year? Who didn't? The reunions are emotional in ways that might surprise you. These men weren't given to displays of sentiment. But when you've wondered for months whether your partner survived a Blackfeet attack or a grizzly mauling, seeing him alive and healthy at rendezvous could bring tears to the eyes of the toughest trapper, but the emotional reunions quickly give way to business. Each man has spent the year collecting beaver pelts, anywhere from 50 to 300 of them, depending on his luck, skill, and survival rate. These pelts represent his entire income for the year, his ticket to financial freedom, his proof that he's mastered one of the most challenging lifestyles imaginable. The trading itself was a complex negotiation that could make or break a man's entire year. The fur companies brought trade goods from St. Louis: blankets, knives, rifles, ammunition, sugar, coffee, flour, and most importantly, whiskey. Lots and lots of whiskey. Here's where the economics get interesting, and not necessarily in the trapper's favor. A prime beaver pelt that might sell for $6 in St. Louis was worth about $4 in trade goods at rendezvous. But those trade goods were marked up by 300 to 500% over their St. Louis prices. A knife that cost $1 in civilization sold for $5 at rendezvous. A gallon of whiskey that cost 25 cents to produce sold for $25 if you could find someone willing to sell it by the gallon rather than by the cup. The fur companies justified these prices by pointing out the enormous costs and risks of hauling goods 1,500 miles into the wilderness. Fair enough. But the result was that mountain men who arrived at rendezvous feeling wealthy often left feeling broke, yet somehow they didn't seem to care. And that tells you something crucial about the mountain man mentality. These men didn't think like businessmen or farmers or any other group in American society. They lived entirely in the present moment. They'd spent a year risking their lives for these pelts, and now they were going to enjoy the rewards, immediately, completely, and without thought for tomorrow. The most legendary aspect of rendezvous was the drinking. We're not talking about a few beers after work here. We're talking about men who'd been sober for 10 months, suddenly having access to unlimited alcohol in a completely unregulated environment. The results were predictably spectacular. Mountain men would trade an entire year's worth of beaver pelts for whiskey and drink themselves into stupors that lasted for days. They'd wake up broke, hungover, and facing another year in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And they'd do it again the next year, but the drinking was just the beginning. Rendezvous became famous for competitions that tested every skill a mountain man needed to survive. Shooting contests with rifles and pistols, where men would compete to hit targets at distances that would challenge modern marksmen. Horse races that covered miles of rough terrain. Wrestling matches between men who were all muscle and sinew and bad temper. Knife-throwing contests, tomahawk-throwing contests, contests to see who could break the most horses in a day. The stakes were serious. Men would bet their rifles, their horses, their entire outfits on the outcome of these competitions. Reputations were made and destroyed based on performance at rendezvous games. A man who could consistently outshoot, outride, and outfight his peers gained status that could save his life in the wilderness. Other trappers would want him as a partner. Indians would respect his prowess, and enemies might think twice about attacking him. But perhaps the most important aspect of rendezvous was the storytelling. This was how information traveled in the mountain man world. News about which streams still had beaver, which passes were safe, which tribes were friendly or hostile. All of this was shared around the campfires during rendezvous. And the stories. My God, the stories these men told. Tales of grisly attacks and narrow escapes, of blizzards that lasted for weeks, of running battles with war parties across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Each story was told and retold, growing more elaborate with each telling, until fact and legend became indistinguishable. This is where figures like Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, and Jedediah Smith became larger than life. Their real exploits were impressive enough, but around the rendezvous campfires they became mythological heroes. Bridger, especially, was famous for his tall tales, stories so outrageous that Jim Bridger story became synonymous with an entertaining lie. But here's the thing about those stories. Even the most outrageous ones usually had some basis in reality. The Mountain Man world was so extreme, so filled with genuine dangers and incredible experiences, that the line between truth and tall tale was often impossible to draw. Take the story of John Colter's run that I mentioned earlier. By the time that tale had been told around a few rendezvous campfires, Colter wasn't just outrunning Blackfeet warriors. He was flying across the prairie, leaping rivers in single bounds and hiding underwater for hours without breathing. But the core of the story, that a naked, weaponless man had escaped from a Blackfeet war party through sheer speed and determination, that was true. The cultural mixing at Rendezvous was unlike anything else in American history. You had New England farm boys drinking with French-Canadian voyageurs, Mexican traders gambling with Shoshone chiefs, Scottish Fur Company clerks learning to dance to flathead music. Marriages were arranged between mountain men and native women. Adoption ceremonies made white trappers into honorary members of Indian tribes. Business partnerships were formed that would last for decades. The language that emerged from this mixing was fascinating, a Creole that combined English, French, Spanish, and multiple native languages. A mountain man might negotiate a horse trade in broken Shoshone, curse in French, and seal the deal with an English handshake. Children grew up trilingual, equally comfortable in a teepee and a trading post. But Rendezvous wasn't just fun and games. It was also where serious business got done. Fur company officials used Rendezvous to gather intelligence about unexplored territories, to recruit experienced trappers for dangerous expeditions, and to assess the competition. Maps were drawn and shared, crude sketches that might show the location of a previously unknown pass or warn about hostile tribes in certain areas. Political alliances were formed and broken at Rendezvous. A tribe that had been friendly to American trappers might arrive with news that British agents had offered them better deals for exclusive trading rights. Mountain men would have to negotiate new agreements or risk losing access to traditional trapping grounds. The medical aspects of Rendezvous were crucial too. This was often the only time all year when injured or sick trappers could get treatment from someone with actual medical knowledge. But company officials usually included a surgeon in their supply trains, and he'd spend Rendezvous extracting arrowheads, setting badly healed bones, and treating infections that had been festering for months. Mental health was addressed too, though they wouldn't have called it that. Men who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness, who'd developed what we might now recognize as PTSD from constant exposure to violence and death, could find companionship and understanding among others who'd faced the same challenges. By the early 1830s, Rendezvous had become so famous that it attracted visitors from the outside world. Wealthy Easterners would travel thousands of miles just to experience this unique gathering. European aristocrats on hunting expeditions would time their trips to coincide with Rendezvous. Army officers exploring Western territories would plan their expeditions to resupply at the annual gathering. These visitors were often shocked by what they found. The violence was casual and constant. Men settling disputes with knives, wrestling matches that could cripple participants, shooting contests where a misfire might kill spectators. The drinking was beyond anything they'd experienced in civilized society. The cultural mixing challenged every assumption they had about racial and social hierarchies, but they were also impressed, despite themselves, by the skills and courage of the mountain men. These visitors would return east with stories of men who could survive in conditions that would kill most civilized people, who could navigate thousands of miles of unmarked wilderness, who could hunt, fight, and trade with equal skill. The economic impact of Rendezvous rippled far beyond the fur trade. The demand for trade goods created supply chains that stretched from New York to the Rocky Mountains. Manufacturers in the East began designing products specifically for the mountain trade. The routes established to supply Rendezvous became the first commercial highways across the Continental Divide. But by the mid-1830s, Rendezvous was already beginning to change. The beaver were disappearing from heavily trapped streams. Fashion was shifting away from beaver felt hats. The economics that had made the mountain man lifestyle possible was starting to collapse. The 1839 rendezvous was smaller and more subdued than previous gatherings. Men were talking about finding new ways to make a living, guiding wagon trains, scouting for the army, establishing trading posts. The writing was on the wall for anyone who could read it. The 1840 rendezvous was the last great gathering. By then, many of the legendary figures were already transitioning to new careers or had died in the wilderness. The age of the mountain man was ending, and everyone knew it. But for 15 years, from 1825 to 1840, Rendezvous had been the center of a unique world. It had created legends, forged alliances, and established the roots and relationships that would guide American expansion across the continent. It had been the place where ordinary men became heroes, where cultures collided and merged, where the mythology of the American West was born around campfires under stars that seemed close enough to touch. The mountain men who gathered at those early rendezvous couldn't have known that they were participating in something that would become part of American legend. They thought they were just doing business, having a good time, and preparing for another year in the wilderness, but they were actually writing the first chapters of the story that would become the American dream. The idea that any man, regardless of his background or circumstances, could head west and reinvent himself completely. That courage and skill mattered more than family connections or formal education. That freedom was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any hardship. Those ideas, born around the campfires of Rendezvous, would outlive the mountain men themselves. They would inspire wagon trains, gold rushes, cattle drives, and every other chapter in the story of Western expansion. The Rendezvous was where America learned to dream about what lay beyond the next mountain range. And for a few brief, shining years, it was the most exciting place on earth. Its dawn on July 6, 1832, and the silence of Pierre's Hole, a beautiful valley in what's now Idaho, is about to be shattered by one of the most violent battles in mountain man history. But here's what makes this moment so significant. This isn't going to be a surprise attack or a small skirmish. This is going to be a full-scale, day-long battle between 200 mountain men and their Indian allies on one side, and 300 Gros Ventre warriors on the other, and it's going to teach everyone involved a lesson about what happens when the mountain man way of life reaches its peak and starts to encounter the forces that will ultimately destroy it. The battle at Pierre's Hole didn't happen in a vacuum. By 1832, the fur trade had reached what we might call its golden age. Beaver populations, though declining in some heavily trapped areas, were still abundant in unexplored regions. The rendezvous system was working perfectly, creating a reliable market for pelts and supplies. The mountain men had perfected their survival techniques, established alliances with key tribes, and mapped every major river system in the Rockies. More importantly, a new generation of mountain men had emerged, men who'd learned the skills from the pioneers but hadn't paid the same brutal price in trial and error. These were trappers who knew from their first day in the wilderness how to set traps efficiently, how to read weather signs, how to avoid the most obvious dangers. They could survive what would have killed the early pioneers, and they were pushing deeper into unexplored territory than anyone had gone before. But this success was creating new problems. The mountain men were no longer operating in empty wilderness. They were part of a complex ecosystem of competing interests, territorial claims, and shifting alliances that made every expedition a potential international incident. Take the situation that led to the battle at Pierre's Hole. The Gros Ventre, allies of the Blackfeet, had come to the valley to trade with white merchants. But a group of mountain men, led by William Sublette, interpreted their presence as a threat. In the atmosphere of constant tension that characterized the fur trade by the early 1830s, any large group of potentially hostile Indians was seen as a target to be attacked before they could attack first. The battle that followed lasted from sunrise to sunset and involved some of the most famous names in mountain man history. Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, Joe Meek, William Sublette, all of them were there fighting for their lives in a conflict that nobody really wanted, but nobody knew how to avoid. The casualties were horrific. Dozens of men died on both sides. Sublette took a bullet in the shoulder that nearly killed him. Several mountain men who'd survived years of wilderness dangers died in what was essentially a misunderstanding that escalated into warfare. But here's what really gets me about Pierre's Hole. It demonstrated that the mountain man world was becoming too crowded, too competitive, too violent to sustain itself much longer. The era when individual trappers could disappear into vast, empty wilderness was ending. Too many people were competing for the same resources in the same territory, and the resources themselves were disappearing. By the early 1830s, experienced mountain men were having to travel farther and work harder to find beaver in quantities that made trapping profitable. Streams that had yielded hundreds of pelts just 5 years earlier were now essentially trapped out. Virgin territory was becoming harder and harder to find. This scarcity was changing the character of the men who entered the trade. The early mountain men had been drawn by the promise of easy wealth, the idea that you could make a fortune in a year or two and then return to civilization to live comfortably. But by 1830, everyone knew that wasn't realistic anymore. The men who stayed in the mountains were those who discovered they couldn't live any other way. These were men like Hugh Glass, who kept returning to the wilderness despite being mauled by a grizzly. Men like Jim Bridger, who spent more than 40 years in the Rockies and became more comfortable around a campfire than in a parlor. Men like Kit Carson, who tried civilian life several times but always ended up back in buckskins. They were also, increasingly, men who were running from something. The mountain man community of the 1830s included a significant number of fugitives, deserters, men fleeing debts or failed marriages or criminal charges. The wilderness had always attracted misfits, but now it was becoming a refuge for men who literally couldn't go home again. This changing character of the mountain man community created new tensions and new dangers. Men who were desperate or mentally unstable were more likely to take unnecessary risks, to violate tribal agreements, to start fights over trivial matters. The informal codes of honor and cooperation that had helped the early trappers survive began to break down under the pressure of too many volatile personalities, competing for diminishing resources. The most dramatic example of how dangerous this world was becoming can be seen in the career of Jedediah Smith, one of the most skilled and famous mountain men of his generation. Smith was everything a mountain man should be: tough, skilled, intelligent, and absolutely fearless. He'd survived grizzly attacks, Blackfeet raids, and winters that killed other men. He'd explored more unmapped territory than any other individual in American history. He'd led expeditions across the Sierra Nevada, through the Mojave Desert, and up the Pacific coast. He was, by any measure, one of the most capable wilderness travelers who ever lived. In May 1831, Smith was leading a small party along the Cimarron River in what's now Kansas when they encountered a Comanche war party. The Comanches were the finest light cavalry in North America, warriors who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. They controlled the southern plains with a combination of mobility, firepower, and tactical brilliance that made them nearly unbeatable in open country. Smith and his men were caught in exactly the kind of situation that mountain men had learned to avoid: outnumbered, in open terrain, facing mounted enemies who knew the ground better than they did. It should have been a routine tactical withdrawal. Give up some horses and supplies, avoid direct confrontation, live to trap another day. But something went wrong. Maybe Smith tried to negotiate when he should have retreated. Maybe the Comanches decided this was too good an opportunity to pass up. Maybe it was just bad luck and worse timing. The details are unclear. But the result was definitive. Jedediah Smith, the man who'd survived everything the wilderness could throw at him, was killed by Comanche lances on a dusty riverbank 1,000 miles from the mountains that had made him famous. When news of Smith's death reached the mountain man community, It sent shockwaves through men who'd thought themselves invincible. If Jedediah Smith could be killed by Indians, if his skill and experience and legendary luck hadn't been enough to save him, then maybe none of them were as safe as they'd believed. Smith's death marked the beginning of the end of the Mountain Man's golden age. Though few recognized it at the time, the wilderness was becoming more dangerous, not because the dangers were new, but because the margins for error were shrinking. There were more trappers competing for fewer beaver, more tribal conflicts disrupting traditional relationships, more pressure from fur companies to take risks that prudent men would have avoided. The economic pressures were intensifying too. By 1833, prime beaver pelts that had once sold for $6 were bringing only $4. Operating costs, supplies, transportation, insurance against losses were rising as competition increased. Individual trappers were finding it harder and harder to make the kind of money that had originally drawn them west. Some adapted by forming larger partnerships that could spread risks and costs among more people. Others diversified into buffalo robes, wolf pelts, and other fur products. A few tried their hand at trading directly with Indian tribes, using their language skills and cultural knowledge to compete with established fur companies, but many simply accepted that the easy money was gone and stayed in the mountains because they'd found something more valuable than wealth, a way of life that matched their temperament perfectly. These were the men who defined the mature mountain man culture of the 1830s. They weren't looking to get rich quick and retire. They were career trappers who'd made peace with the dangers and hardships, because the alternative, returning to civilization, had become unthinkable. Their skills had reached levels that bordered on the supernatural. They could track a single elk through forest where most people couldn't see any trail at all. They could predict weather changes hours before they occurred, navigate by stars through regions they'd never seen before, and survive on resources that would escape the notice of ordinary people. But perhaps most importantly, they developed a philosophical acceptance of death that allowed them to function in an environment where violence was constant and sudden. They didn't court death or become reckless, but they'd made peace with the idea that their lives could end at any moment for reasons completely beyond their control. This acceptance wasn't fatalism. It was realism. A mountain man who spent too much time worrying about all the things that could kill him would become paralyzed by fear. Better to acknowledge the dangers, take reasonable precautions, and then focus on the job at hand. The job, by the mid-1830s, was becoming increasingly difficult. Beaver populations were declining rapidly in all the easily accessible areas. New territory was harder to find and more dangerous to explore. The Blackfeet were intensifying their warfare against American trappers, using better weapons and more sophisticated tactics acquired through their trade relationships with British companies. At the same time, the federal government was beginning to take a more active interest in Western territories. Army expeditions were mapping regions that had been the exclusive domain of mountain men. Government officials were negotiating treaties with tribes that had previously dealt only with individual trappers. The informal, anarchic world that had allowed mountain men to operate outside all legal and social constraints was slowly being replaced by formal territorial administration. Some mountain men welcomed these changes, seeing opportunities to use their knowledge and skills in new ways. Others viewed government intervention as the beginning of the end for their way of life. Both groups were right. The changes were most visible at the annual rendezvous, which by 1835 had become noticeably different from the wild, anarchic gatherings of the previous decade. Government agents now attended regularly, gathering information and trying to establish formal relationships with tribal leaders. Missionaries were appearing, attempting to convert both Indians and mountain men to Christianity. Eastern merchants were sending representatives to assess new business opportunities. The rendezvous was still wild and dangerous. Men were still gambling away entire years' earnings, fighting duels over insults, and drinking themselves into unconsciousness. But there was a sense that outside forces were encroaching on this unique world, that the days of complete freedom were numbered. The most ominous change was in the economics of the fur trade itself. European fashion was shifting away from beaver felt hats towards silk alternatives that were cheaper to produce and easier to obtain. The market for beaver pelts, which had sustained the entire mountain man economy for more than 30 years, was beginning to collapse. Fur company officials were reluctant to share this information with their trappers, but rumors were spreading throughout the mountain man community. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives perfecting skills that had only one commercial application were beginning to wonder what they'd do if that application disappeared. Some were already hedging their bets. Jim Bridger was exploring opportunities in the horse trade, using his connections with friendly tribes to obtain animals that could be sold to emigrants heading west. Kit Carson was developing a reputation as a guide who could safely escort travelers through dangerous territory. Joe Meek was considering a move to Oregon Territory, where his wilderness skills might be valuable in a different context. But for every mountain man who was planning for the future, there was another who refused to acknowledge that change was coming. These men continued trapping with the same intensity and skill they'd always shown, convinced that market conditions would improve and that their way of life would continue indefinitely. The 1836 Rendezvous was the last truly great gathering of the mountain man era. More than 1,500 people attended, representing every aspect of the fur trade community. The competitions were as fierce as ever, the drinking as legendary, the storytelling as outrageous. For 2 weeks in July, it seemed like the golden age would continue forever. But beneath the celebration, experienced observers could see signs of decline. Fewer young men were entering the trade. Established trappers were talking more about alternative careers. The fur companies were diversifying into other products. The tribal alliances that had made large-scale trapping possible were becoming unstable as government officials tried to establish formal treaty relationships. Most significantly, the beaver were simply running out. Streams that had once supported dozens of trappers were now yielding barely enough pelts to justify the effort of checking them. Virgin territory was becoming almost impossible to find. Every major river system in the Rockies had been explored and exploited. The writing was on the wall for anyone who could read it. The era of the mountain man was entering its final phase, and the men who defined American expansion for more than 3 decades would have to find new ways to survive in a world that no longer needed their unique combination of skills and knowledge, but they'd go out fighting. The late 1830s would see some of the most dramatic adventures, most violent conflicts, and most legendary exploits in mountain man history. Men who knew their way of life was ending would push themselves to extremes that amazed even their peers. They'd also begin the transformation that would make them legends in American mythology. The skills that had made them successful trappers, wilderness knowledge, cultural adaptation, physical toughness, psychological resilience, would prove equally valuable in new roles as guides. Scouts, interpreters, and mediators, the mountain men weren't disappearing, they were evolving, and their evolution would shape the next chapter of American Western expansion in ways that nobody, including the mountain men themselves, could have predicted. The golden age was ending, but the legend was just beginning. And the blood and beaver that had defined their world for 30 years would be remembered long after the last trap was pulled from the last stream in the high country they'd made their own. Picture Jim Bridger standing in the middle of what would be the last great rendezvous in 1840, and try to imagine what he's thinking. This man has spent more than half his life in the Rocky Mountains. He's survived grizzly attacks, Blackfeet raids, winters that killed other men, and accidents that should have ended his career a dozen times over. He's as close to a living legend as the mountain man world has produced. But now, at age 36, still young by civilized standards, but ancient by mountain man measures, Jim Bridger is watching his world die. The 1840 rendezvous at Green River is smaller than anyone can remember. Maybe 300 people total, compared to the 1,500 who'd gathered just 4 years earlier. The energy is different too. Instead of the raucous celebration and fierce competition that had characterized previous gatherings, there's a subdued, almost melancholy atmosphere. Men are saying goodbye to friends they know they'll never see again. The numbers tell the story better than words ever could. Beaver pelts that sold for $6 in 1820 are now bringing less than $2, when you can find buyers at all. The silk hat industry has almost completely replaced beaver felt in European and American fashion. What took 30 years to build is collapsing in less than 5. But here's what makes this collapse so tragic. It's not happening because the mountain men failed at what they set out to do. It's happening because they succeeded too well. They'd mapped every river, explored every valley, trapped every beaver stream in the Rocky Mountain West. They'd created trade relationships with dozens of tribes, established routes that would become the highways of Western expansion, and proven that white Americans could not only survive but thrive in the most challenging environment on the continent. Their success had made them obsolete. The beaver were virtually extinct in most areas that had once supported hundreds of trappers. 30 years of intensive trapping had reduced populations to levels that couldn't sustain commercial exploitation. Some streams that had yielded 300 pelts annually in the 1820s now produced fewer than 20. Even more devastating was the shift in fashion that had nothing to do with what was happening in the American wilderness. In London and Paris, hat makers had perfected techniques for working with silk that produced headwear that was lighter, more weather-resistant, and cheaper than beaver felt. Gentlemen who'd once paid premium prices for beaver hats were switching to silk alternatives that cost a fraction as much. The mountain men had spent decades risking their lives to supply a market that was disappearing while they worked. For men whose entire identity was built around their ability to adapt to any challenge, this economic reality was almost impossible to accept. How do you fight an enemy you can't see, negotiate with market forces that don't care about your skill or courage, adapt to changes that have nothing to do with your ability to survive in the wilderness? Some tried to maintain the old ways by pushing into even more remote territory. Small groups of die-hard trappers headed north into regions that are now Western Canada, or south into Mexico, searching for streams that hadn't been trapped out. A few found temporary success, but they were operating on such a small scale that they could barely cover their expenses. Others attempted to diversify their operations. Buffalo robes were still in demand for winter coats and blankets. Wolf pelts brought decent prices from Eastern manufacturers. Some trappers tried their hand at capturing wild horses for the growing market of emigrants heading west. But these alternatives couldn't replace the income that beaver trapping had provided, and they required different skills and different relationships with native tribes. A man who'd spent 20 years perfecting the art of beaver trapping couldn't instantly become an expert buffalo hunter or horse trader. The psychological impact of this transition was enormous. Imagine spending your entire adult life mastering a set of skills that made you one of the most capable people on Earth, then watching those skills become economically worthless almost overnight. These weren't men who'd planned for retirement or developed backup careers. They were specialists whose specialty had suddenly vanished. Kit Carson, one of the most famous mountain men, later described the period around 1840 as the most difficult time of his life, more challenging than any grizzly attack or Indian battle. A man could fight anything with teeth and claws, he said, but how do you fight changes in fashion happening 3,000 miles away? The rendezvous system, which had been the lifeblood of mountain man society, collapsed along with the beaver market. Without enough trappers to justify the enormous expense of hauling trade goods into the wilderness, fur companies simply stopped organizing the annual gatherings. The 1840 rendezvous was officially the last. Though a few informal gatherings continued for several more years, But these smaller meetings lacked the economic purpose and cultural energy that had made Rendezvous the center of mountain man life. For many mountain men, the end of Rendezvous meant the end of their primary social connection to other human beings. These were men who'd spent most of their time alone, but had depended on the annual gathering to maintain friendships, share information, and feel part of something larger than themselves. Without Rendezvous, the mountain man community began to scatter and fragment. Some trappers simply disappeared into the wilderness and were never seen again. Whether they died alone in the mountains or found new lives under different names, nobody knows. Others drifted toward the few remaining trading posts, trying to maintain some connection to their old way of life. But the smartest and most adaptable mountain men recognized that their wilderness skills, while no longer valuable for trapping, were becoming incredibly valuable for something else, guiding the increasing number of emigrants who were heading west. The same routes the mountain men had used to reach beaver streams were perfect for wagon trains heading to Oregon and California. The same knowledge of water sources, mountain passes, and tribal territories that had kept trappers alive could keep families safe during the 1,000-mile journey to new homes in the West. Jim Bridger was among the first to recognize this opportunity. In 1843, he established a trading post and way station on the Oregon Trail that became known as Fort Bridger. Immigrants could resupply, repair their wagons, and hire Bridger or one of his associates as a guide for the most dangerous parts of the journey. The irony was perfect. The mountain men who'd spent decades avoiding civilization were now making their living by helping civilization follow them into the wilderness. Kit Carson found similar opportunities as a guide and scout. His knowledge of southwestern territories made him invaluable to military expeditions and civilian parties heading to California. During the Mexican-American War, Carson served as a courier and scout for American forces, using trails he'd learned as a trapper to carry messages across hostile territory. Joe Meek headed to Oregon Territory, where his wilderness experience and political connections made him a natural leader in the territorial government. He served as a sheriff, legislator, and Indian agent, bridging the gap between the rough frontier society and the more formal governmental structures that were being established. But for every mountain man who successfully transitioned to a new career, there was another who couldn't or wouldn't adapt to the changing times. Some tried to return to the settled areas they'd left decades earlier, only to discover that they no longer fit into civilized society. After 20 years in the wilderness, a man might find that he couldn't sleep indoors, couldn't tolerate crowds, couldn't adjust to the rules and restrictions of town life. Their skills, tracking, hunting, fighting, surviving in extreme conditions, had no application in a world of farms, shops, and offices. Some of these men became drifters, moving from town to town, working temporary jobs, drinking too much, and telling stories that nobody quite believed. They'd become living relics of a world that had disappeared while they weren't looking. Others found that their reputation as Indian fighters and wilderness survivors made them valuable to communities on the expanding frontier. Towns facing Indian troubles would hire former mountain men as scouts or military leaders. Railroad companies employed them to survey routes through difficult terrain. Territorial governments used them as negotiators in treaty discussions with native tribes. But perhaps the most significant transformation was happening to the native peoples who'd been the mountain men's allies, enemies, and neighbors for 30 years. The decline of the fur trade meant that tribes like the Shoshone and Crow lost their primary connection to white society and the manufactured goods they'd come to depend on. At the same time, the increasing number of emigrants crossing their territories brought new pressures and conflicts. The relationships that mountain men had spent decades building with various tribes became valuable assets in this changing environment. Former trappers who'd married into native families, learned tribal languages, and understood Indian customs became crucial intermediaries between white settlers and native peoples. But these relationships also created tragic conflicts of loyalty. Mountain men who'd lived as honorary members of Indian tribes were now being asked to serve as scouts for military expeditions against those same tribes. Men who'd found refuge and family in native communities were being forced to choose sides in conflicts that would ultimately destroy the world they'd helped create. The mixed-blood children of mountain men and native women found themselves in particularly difficult positions. They were too white for full acceptance in tribal society and too Indian for full acceptance in white society. Many became professional interpreters, cultural mediators, and guides, using their bicultural background to survive in a world that was increasingly divided along racial lines. By 1845, the transformation was essentially complete. The age of the independent mountain man was over. The men who remained in the West had either found new occupations that utilized their wilderness skills or had faded into obscurity and poverty. The timing of this transition coincided almost perfectly with the great wave of Western migration that would define the 1840s and 50s. Just as the mountain men were losing their primary occupation, thousands of American families were heading west and desperately needed the services that only former mountain men could provide. It was as if history had choreographed the transition. The pathfinders finished mapping the wilderness just as the settlers arrived to claim it. The men who'd proven that Americans could survive in the West were available to guide other Americans in making the journey safely. But for the mountain men themselves, this transition was bittersweet at best. They'd achieved something unprecedented in human history. They'd mastered a lifestyle that combined complete personal freedom with economic opportunity. For 30 years, they'd lived entirely on their own terms in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Now they were being forced to rejoin the very civilization they'd rejected, to accept the constraints and compromises they'd spent their lives avoiding. Even those who successfully transitioned to new careers never quite recaptured the sense of absolute independence that had defined their mountain man years. The dream was dying, but it wasn't disappearing. It was being transformed into something new, the mythology of the American West that would inspire generations of Americans to believe that any individual, regardless of background or circumstances, could head west and create a new life through courage, skill, and determination. The mountain men had lost their occupation, but they'd gained immortality. Their brief, brilliant moment in American history would be remembered long after the beaver streams had been forgotten. Long after the last trap had rusted away, long after the mountains themselves had been settled and civilized, they'd proven something that would become central to American identity, that freedom was possible, that wilderness could be mastered, that ordinary men could become extraordinary through their willingness to risk everything for the chance to live entirely on their own terms. The dream was dead. But the legend was just beginning. It's 1868, and an aging Jim Bridger stands on a platform at the Omaha train station, watching the Union Pacific Railroad push west across the prairie toward the Rocky Mountains. He's 64 years old now, white-haired and partly blind, but still recognizable as the legendary mountain man who'd spent 40 years in the wilderness. The irony of this moment would be lost on most observers, but not on Bridger. He's here as a consultant for the railroad, using his knowledge of mountain passes and water sources to help engineers plan the route that will finally connect east and west with bands of steel, the same trails he'd walked as a young trapper. Carrying beaver pelts are about to become the pathway for the technology that will end the frontier forever. But here's what I want you to understand about this scene. Jim Bridger isn't bitter about the changes he's witnessing. He's proud of them because by 1868, he and other surviving mountain men have come to realize something that wasn't clear during the collapse of the fur trade 20 years earlier. They hadn't failed. They'd succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Every mile of railroad track being laid across the West followed routes first mapped by mountain men. Every major wagon trail, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail, had been blazed by trappers searching for beaver streams. Every strategic mountain pass, every reliable water source, every safe camping spot used by hundreds of thousands of emigrants had been discovered by men carrying steel traps and living entirely outside civilization. The mountain men had done something unprecedented in human history. They'd mapped and mastered an entire continent in the space of 30 years. They'd proven that the American West wasn't an impassable barrier to expansion, but a highway to opportunity. They'd turned the unknown into the familiar, the impossible into the inevitable, and they'd done it not through military conquest or corporate planning, but through individual initiative, personal courage, and the willingness to risk everything for the chance to live free. By the 1860s, this achievement was finally being recognized for what it really was, the foundation of American continental empire. When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, the ceremony at Promontory Point included speeches praising the engineers, financiers, and workers who'd made the project possible. But knowledgeable observers understood that the real credit belonged to the mountain men who'd identified the only practical route through the Rocky Mountains. 40 years earlier, South Pass, the gentle gap in the continental divide that made wagon travel possible, had been discovered by mountain men in the early 1820s. Every major river crossing, every mountain pass, every strategic landmark along the railroad route had been mapped and named by trappers whose primary concern was finding beaver. The same pattern held throughout the West. When gold was discovered in California, the routes that carried 300,000 fortune seekers to the Pacific were paths first walked by mountain men. When Mormon pioneers established their desert kingdom in Utah, they followed trails blazed by Jim Bridger and his contemporaries. When cattle drives began moving millions of longhorns from Texas to Kansas railheads, they used routes pioneered by trappers heading to and from the annual rendezvous. The mountain men had literally written the map of American expansion, but their contribution went far beyond geography. They'd also established the relationships with native peoples that would determine how Western settlement proceeded, for better and worse. The tribal alliances that mountain men had forged during the fur trade era became crucial factors in later military campaigns. Tribes like the Shoshone and Crow, who'd been allied with American trappers, generally sided with the U.S. military during the Indian Wars of the 1860s and 70s. Their knowledge of enemy territories and tactics, gained through their relationships with mountain men, proved invaluable to American forces. Conversely, tribes like the Blackfeet, who'd been at war with American trappers, remained hostile to American expansion much longer. The patterns of alliance and enmity established during the Mountain Man era influenced Western military strategy for decades. The mixed-blood children of mountain men and native women became some of the most important figures in Western development. These bicultural individuals served as interpreters, guides, negotiators, and cultural bridges during the complex and often violent process of American territorial expansion. Men like Baptiste Charbonneau, the son of Sacagawea and Toussaint Charbonneau, used their unique backgrounds to mediate between cultures that often couldn't understand each other. Women like Marie Dorion, a mixed-blood woman who'd survived incredible hardships during the early fur trade, became legendary figures in their own right. These descendants of mountain men possessed knowledge and skills that couldn't be learned from books or acquired through formal training. They understood both the practical aspects of wilderness survival and the subtle cultural codes that governed relationships between different peoples. Their contributions to Western development were often invisible to contemporary observers, but absolutely essential to the process. The economic legacy of the mountain men was equally significant, though it took decades to become fully apparent. The fur trade itself had generated relatively modest wealth, perhaps $50 million total over 30 years. But the information and infrastructure that mountain men created enabled economic development worth billions. Every railroad, every mining operation, every cattle ranch, every agricultural settlement in the West benefited from knowledge that mountain men had acquired through personal experience. They'd identified which rivers were navigable, which valleys had good soil, which regions had mineral potential. Their reports and guidance shaped investment decisions that determined where Western development would succeed or fail. The town of Denver, for example, was established near the confluence of two rivers that had been thoroughly explored by mountain men. The site was chosen partly because trappers had identified it as a natural crossroads with access to mountain passes, prairie routes, and reliable water supplies. San Francisco's importance as a Pacific port was recognized by mountain men who'd traveled overland from the Rockies and understood the strategic value of its protected harbor. The agricultural potential of California's Central Valley was reported by trappers who'd crossed it in search of beaver streams. Time and again, the economic geography of the American West reflected knowledge and insights that mountain men had gained through decades of direct experience. But perhaps the most important legacy of the mountain men wasn't economic or geographic. It was cultural. They'd created a new model of what it meant to be American. The idea that any individual, regardless of background or social position, could head west and reinvent himself completely was largely derived from mountain man experience. These weren't aristocrats or educated professionals who'd conquered the wilderness. They were farm boys, clerks, immigrants, and misfits who transformed themselves into some of the most capable people on earth through skill, courage, and determination. This became the template for the American dream in its most pure form. The belief that personal freedom and individual achievement were more important than social status or inherited privilege. The conviction that Americans could master any challenge, survive any hardship, succeed in any environment if they were willing to risk everything for the chance to live on their own terms. By the 1870s and 80s, as the frontier began to close and the last free lands were claimed, Americans started to romanticize the mountain man era as a golden age of freedom and adventure. Men like Kit Carson and Jim Bridger became folk heroes. Their real accomplishments expanded into mythological proportions. Wild West shows featured performers claiming to be former mountain men, telling increasingly fantastic stories about grisly fights and Indian battles. Dime novels and magazine articles portrayed the trappers as superhuman characters who could outshoot, outfight, and outsmart any opponent. This mythologizing process sometimes obscured the real achievements of the historical mountain men, but it also preserved and transmitted their essential message, that Americans were different from other peoples because they were willing to risk everything for freedom. The aging mountain men themselves had mixed feelings about their growing legendary status. Some, like Buffalo Bill Cody, who'd been too young to be a real mountain man but claimed the title anyway, embraced the celebrity and made fortunes telling stories about the old days. Others, like the real Jim Bridger, were more ambivalent about the attention. Bridger was famous for his tall tales, stories so outrageous that Jim Bridger story became synonymous with an entertaining lie. But when Eastern reporters came to interview him about his mountain man experiences, he often seemed more interested in talking about practical matters like railroad routes and irrigation projects than about his adventures with grizzly bears and hostile Indians. Perhaps he understood something that the mythmakers missed. The mountain men's real legacy wasn't their individual heroics, but their collective achievement in opening a continent to settlement and development. As the 19th century drew to a close, the last of the original mountain men were dying off. Kit Carson had died in 1868. Jedediah Smith had been killed by Comanches back in 1831. Hugh Glass, the man who'd crawled 200 miles after being mauled by a grizzly, had been killed by Arikara warriors in 1833. Jim Bridger lived until 1881, long enough to see the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the end of the Indian Wars, and the settlement of virtually every corner of the territory he'd spent his life exploring. When he died, newspapers across the country ran obituaries describing him as the last link to the heroic age of Western exploration. But the mountain men's influence didn't die with them. Their routes became highways, their campsites became cities, their trading relationships became the foundation for territorial governments. Their cultural values became central to American identity. More importantly, they'd proven something that would shape American thinking for generations, that wilderness wasn't an enemy to be feared, but a resource to be utilized, that distance and difficulty weren't barriers, but challenges to be overcome, that the American continent was big enough to accommodate any dream, bold enough to pursue it. The environmental cost of this achievement became apparent only much later. The beaver populations that mountain men had decimated never fully recovered. The native societies that had been disrupted by the fur trade were largely destroyed by later waves of settlement. The pristine wilderness that had challenged and inspired the trappers was transformed into farms, ranches, mines, and cities. But in the context of their time, the mountain men represented something unprecedented. Ordinary Americans who'd expanded their nation's borders through individual initiative rather than military conquest or corporate planning. They'd claimed a continent not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through their willingness to live on the land's terms while gradually learning to bend it to their purposes. Today, when you drive through the Rocky Mountains, on interstate highways that follow routes first mapped by beaver trappers, it's easy to forget how incredible their achievement really was. They'd walked across an entire continent with nothing but the gear they could carry, survived in conditions that would challenge modern adventurers with all their sophisticated equipment, and mapped territory that had been unknown to Western civilization. They'd done it for beaver pelts and personal freedom, but they'd actually accomplished something much larger. They'd proven that Americans could adapt to any environment, master any challenge, succeed anywhere on Earth if they were willing to risk everything for the chance. That lesson became central to American identity and remains relevant today. Every astronaut who ventures into space, every entrepreneur who starts a new business, every immigrant who comes to America seeking opportunity is following the trail. First blazed by mountain men who headed west with steel traps and unlimited confidence in their ability to succeed wherever their courage could take them. The mountain men had lived for 30 years at the absolute edge of human possibility, in a place where freedom was complete and consequences were immediate. They'd created a unique society based on skill rather than status, courage rather than connections, individual achievement rather than inherited privilege. That society had lasted only as long as the beaver streams held out, but its values became part of the American character forever. The ghosts of the high country had become the soul of the nation, and their brief, brilliant moment in history had illuminated possibilities that would inspire Americans for generations to come. The mountains still remember them. Every canyon and creek, every pass and peak holds the memory of men who'd chosen to live entirely on their own terms in the most beautiful and dangerous place on Earth. They'd found freedom in the wilderness and left it as a gift for everyone who came after them. That was their real legacy. Not the pelts they'd trapped or the routes they'd mapped, but the proof they'd provided that Americans could be anything they had the courage to become.